After the fall of the Syrian regime of Assad, Russia seems poised to leave the Middle East, calling into question its relationship with Israel as well. Welcome back to another All Israel News update. I'm Hanan Lischinsky, and today we'll talk about the ups and downs and the changing relationship between Russia, this huge empire in the north, and Israel, and the changing power dynamics between the two countries. Now let's start to look at the past, where Russia and Israel share a deep history. Many of the state's founders here in Israel either came directly from Russia or one of the many countries surrounding it that were part of the Soviet Union. Most of them spoke Russian, and they brought their culture and their ways of thinking and deeply enmeshed it into the roots of the state. And even later, even in the 90s, there were close to 1 million of mostly Russian-speaking Jews from the Soviet Union that came to Israel. And there are several towns here until today where you can see concentrations of Russian shops. You even see Russian signage sometimes in several of the towns, especially on the coast. Many of our Russian or former Soviet Jewish brothers, they love the coast, they love the beaches and the warm weather, and that's where they tend to settle often. So there is a very noticeable connection between the Russian-speaking Jews, the Russians in Russia, and Israel as well. Now, these close cultural and ties between peoples always translated also into a relatively close political connection. At the beginning, for the first couple of years, the Soviet Union was even closer to Israel than the United States, despite this, of course, changing soon. But even afterwards, Russia and Israel always had relatively good relations, despite the close relations between the US and Israel. Also, or especially during the early years of current President Putin's tenure as president of Russia, he and Netanyahu always had very close personal relations. And this peaked during the, let's say, the early 2010s until 2015, 16, 17, where there were frequent meetings between Israeli officials and Russian officials. Netanyahu visited Moscow several times in those years, and all of this continued even though Russia entered the Syrian civil war and established a massive military presence right on Israel's border. But despite this, due to the good relations between the leaderships, Israel continued to strike Iranian presence in Syria, and always did this in very close coordination with the Russian forces, so as not to harm Russian forces by maybe strike by mistake the Russian forces there. So all of this, there was a very well-functioning mechanism between the IDF and the Russian forces in Syria, and also the two political leaderships. But that all changed when Russia began the war in Ukraine in 2022 and entered Ukraine. So when Russia began entering Ukraine, the whole Western axis, NATO and all the Western countries swung behind Ukraine, and basically the whole world was forced to take sides. Now Israel was kind of in the middle, because Israel needed the close cooperation, the close relations with Russia in order to continue striking Iranian weapons smuggling and Iranian presence in Syria. But on the other hand, Ukraine has a Jewish president, and Ukraine became really part of, and even one of the main projects of all these, the Western country of NATO. And this is, of course, Israel's natural place as a Western ally and an ally of NATO and of the US. So Israel really fell in between these two parties and tried this balancing act, really, of trying not to offend Russia too much. And for example, Israel was criticized, and even internally in Israel, many voices criticized that Israel, for example, didn't transfer weapons to Ukraine, especially aerial defense weapons that would enable Ukraine to defend against Russia's rocket, missile, and drone attacks. Now, speaking of drones, Russia increasingly started to use and become dependent on Iranian-produced drones, and this really strengthened the relations between Russia and Iran, so further moving Russia into this axis of Israel's enemies. So these developments really led to a deterioration of the once very close ties between Russia and Israel. They didn't fall apart completely, the relations didn't collapse, but more and more We heard Russian officials criticize Israeli strikes in Syria. Israeli intelligence noticed a closer cooperation between Russian and Iranian elements in Syria, enabling more weapons smuggling, and weapon smuggling especially from Iran to Hezbollah. And when the Gaza war started after October 7, Russian officials strongly criticized Israel's actions there and really took a very strong public stance against Israel amid all of these wars, and really showing publicly that the relations had entered another phase. Again, the relations didn't collapse completely, and even just a couple of weeks ago, Strategic Affairs Minister Dermer visited Russia to cooperate with Russia on, to coordinate with Russia on the Lebanon ceasefire. So the relations are still there. There's still open communication channels, but at least publicly, the relations have really entered a phase that could almost be described as hostile at this point. Throughout the past months, there were numerous reports that the Russian military built more and more outposts, even very close to the Israeli border in the Golan Heights. It built new bases there. It also announced it would increase its aerial patrols to ensure the security of the Syrian state, something to that effect. Again, signaling something that in Israel is being received as a hostile intent and support for very hostile elements and the enemies of Israel. So if we're summing up the situation between Russia and Israel, until just 2 weeks ago, the relations were really in a slow deterioration, and Russia and Israel really aligned themselves on two different axes, and Russia just joined the axis of the enemies of Israel. And this could also be seen, again, as I said, in the public statements by Russian officials, in the Russian media, in Russian behavior and votes in the UN councils, Security Council, and so forth. So Israel really swung behind, Russia really swung behind the enemies of Israel. And that was the situation 2 weeks ago, but then the rebels in Syria, rebel groups, began their lightning advance from the north all the way to the capital of Syria, Damascus, and now yesterday the regime fell, Assad fell, and all of this axis that I just described, Russia, Iran, and all of the proxy forces collapsed within a day. So despite the sizable investment that I described earlier of Russia's military bases, military airports, a huge port in Syria, while in the first couple of days there were reports that Russia carried out airstrikes and helped the Syrian army stop the advance of the rebels, in the past couple of days all of this basically disappeared, fell apart. The Syrian army ran away, and in parallel we had hardly any more reports that the Russian Air Force was really helping the Syrian army, and they apparently just hunkered down in their bases waiting for an order of what to do. And what we saw was that the Russian military really withdrew in the last couple of days. Apparently, from what we know now, there aren't very detailed reports, but it seems that most of the Russian forces have withdrawn from their bases across Syria, withdrawn to the coastal area where there are very large Russian bases, and Russia really seems to be in the process of dismantling its whole military operation in Syria, and that is a massive development that will have huge consequences, not just for Syria and the Middle East, but also across Africa, where the Russian military was very active. And all of this will, of course, have an impact also on the Ukrainian war and on Europe and the world in general. So the impact here in the Middle East will be especially dramatic for the Iranian axis, which had, especially in the last couple of years, really allied with the Russians, enjoyed a kind of air defense umbrella because the Russians had very advanced anti-air defense systems stationed across Syria, which was something that had always worried the IDF and the Israeli Air Force, and is now completely gone within a day, enabling the IDF to operate much more freely across the Middle East against Iranian interests. Now, regarding the Russian interests themselves, Russia didn't really have a lot of impact on the Middle East itself, on Middle Eastern politics in the last couple of years, but the Russian bases, the huge air base in Khmeimim and the port in Tartus, were very important as transportational nodes in a Russian network that stretched all the way to Africa, where many of the Russian mercenaries and other troops were stationed to prop up several African regimes that were allied with Russia, and all of this is now in the danger of collapsing as well. And this, of course, is a huge propaganda coup against Putin. It's a huge embarrassment for Putin. It's a harm to Russian prestige across Africa and the Middle East. But also this signals a setback for the Russian military, while it still is embroiled in the war in Ukraine. So if we're looking back now at the impact and the consequences all of this has on Israel, as I laid out in the beginning, one of the main rationales for Israel having very good relations with Russia was the threat that Russia posed on Israel's northeastern border, and that is now gone. So we will have to see what happens now with the relations between Russia and Israel. If the Israeli government would decide, it could now very strongly pivot to the side of NATO, to the side of Ukraine, to the side of the US in this conflict, and really take a public stance against Russia in the same way that Russia has taken a public stance against Israel. That so far hasn't really happened, and it will be very interesting to observe what the Israeli government will do as a result of the collapse of the Russian military presence on its border. So as you may have noticed, these are really interesting times, really rapidly unfolding events here. Every day almost people are joking whose regime is going to fall today. And Israel really is in the middle of historic events, strategic shifts across the region. And Russia was one piece of the puzzle in that regard. So if you want to continue to receive our latest updates, our analysis about the role of Israel and the impact on Israel all of these events have, continue to follow us on allisrael.com. Leave a like under this video, follow our YouTube channel and all the other social media channels.